Hi, Doug Goldstein here. I'm really excited to be sharing this interview that I just did with Eli Noff. Eli is a CPA and a lawyer. He's based in the United States, although he also is Israeli, so he speaks English and Hebrew. He was talking to us about a really critical problem that a lot of Americans have when they move to Israel. Specifically, they're not always so careful at keeping up their informational filings, and gosh, what's that, as well as their regular tax filings to the IRS. Information filings are forms that people have to file to the U.S. government telling the United States about assets they have in Israel. Now, a lot of Israelis have this. This is normal. You live in Israel, you work here, you have a pension plan, maybe some savings, maybe some investments. A lot of Americans who've been here for 5, 10, 15, 20 years or more, they kind of think, well, what does America need to know about that? And I'm anyway paying tax in Israel. Turns out this is not only a huge mistake, which is something I've discussed on the Goldstein on Gelt Show before, but the penalties can be severe. In fact, the penalty for not reporting could be much more money than you didn't report about. It's a little bit over the top. You have to hear this interview with Eli Noff. He also talks to us about some options that people have right now if they're in a little bit of hot water, even by accident, what they can do to clean up their act. It is so important that people get on top of dealing with their investment and their tax situation, because if you don't do it now, the information sharing going on between the United States and Israel is so in depth that literally tomorrow someone could come knocking on your door. So listen to this interview that I do with Eli Noff here on the Goldstein on Gelt Show. Okay, I'm very excited to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show Eli Noff, who is both a CPA and an attorney. He works with people who are cross-border. He's actually based in the U.S., but he comes to Israel on a regular basis. Eli, a real pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
One of the issues that people talk about a lot, or let's say people often feel isn't an issue for them, is that they live in Israel now and they really don't have to be filing returns anymore because after all, they say they're paying taxes in Israel. I'm sure you've heard something like that. Tell me where people like that are going wrong and what they're missing out on.
First of all, thanks for having me on the show. You know, the U.S. tax system taxes American citizens, U.S. citizens and residents on their worldwide income. So I think where some people may be going wrong is they believe once they move outside the United States that they've essentially moved into a territorial tax jurisdiction where their income is no longer taxable in the United States, and that's simply incorrect.
I think one of the reasons people might believe that is in certain places it's true. For example, let's talk about a guy who makes Aliyah. He moves to Israel, and he's earning $60,000 a year here, and let's say he doesn't have investments. He's not going to actually end up paying taxes to America, is he?
Correct, but the filing requirements are still there. So the citizen still must file, or the citizen or resident must still generally file a U.S. income tax return to report the income nonetheless, but there is a foreign earned income exclusion that's generally available. It's indexed for inflation, typically annually, so they may not be required to pay income taxes in the United States. However, there are additional informational reporting forms that may be required to be filed along with that tax return that they should be sensitive to that could carry significant penalties if they're not filed, along with the general requirements of having to file a U.S. income tax return annually.
So I don't want to belittle these forms, but if someone says, listen, I've been living in Israel for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I know I don't owe money to America. Do I really have to file these informational forms? I mean, really, what are they all about? What do you say when someone asks you that?
You know, so generally it's just the basics, bringing it down to basics. So some of the forms that are required to be filed are generally informational reporting forms associated with financial accounts abroad. So a U.S. citizen or resident living outside the United States, or even living in the United States, who has foreign bank accounts must file certain informational reports. There are many of them, but some of them are the FinCEN, Financial Crime Enforcement Network, Form 114, also known as the FBAR, Foreign Bank Account Report, FBAR. You essentially must file that if you have over $10,000 in a foreign bank account, which is essentially an account located outside the United States. Failure to file that form can carry with it penalties of $10,000 per violation. A violation can be, or is generally described as statutorily, a $10,000 penalty per foreign account that's failed to be reported annually. So just as a quick example, you have a U.S. citizen living outside the United States. They live in Israel, for example. They have $50,000 in a bank account, and they have another $25,000 in a savings account. So they have two accounts. They could be subject to non-willful penalties of $20,000, $10,000 per violation, one per account per year. The IRS can look back typically 6 years for these types of penalties. So in that particular scenario, a non-willful penalty can be $120,000, which is 6 years times 20,000. And if the IRS catches it first and the taxpayer doesn't have good reasonable cause, they could be subject to those penalties, and they could be fairly significant.
Wow. So this is talking about not only having to pay a little tax or paying a little fee, but it's actually paying all of the money you didn't report, plus more, simply for not reporting.
Correct. So it's purely informational reports. The FBAR does not carry a tax computation with it. Now, if the account had earned some interest income, surely that should be reported on the income tax return. However, these are purely informational reports that carry with them severe draconian penalties. And the FBAR is one of the primary forms that people should be concerned with.
We're speaking with Eli Noff, who is both a CPA and an attorney. He's based in the U.S., but he actually deals with people overseas. A lot of people, like listeners of the Goldstein on Gelt Show, who are Americans who have moved to Israel and maybe are not fully up to date with all of their U.S. tax reporting and filing. And it seems that there's a lot of legal implications for not doing this. And it's not just that you owe money on a tax return because maybe you earned some interest, but simply the importance of reporting for informational purposes. Eli, recently I know the U.S. and Israel have been getting closer and closer in terms of how they share information. Is there really some sort of in-depth information sharing these days, or is that coming very soon, where someone who says, well, listen, I may have an account at Bank Hapoalim, but who's ever going to know? And that's the old way, and the new way is simply going to be that the IRS and Mas Hachnasa, the Israeli tax authority, are going to be sharing information regularly?
Sure. Some of those banks are already sharing information with the U.S. government, and additional banks are being pressured to do so. So there are already banks that are cooperating with the Internal Revenue Service and providing information with respect to U.S. citizens or residents holding accounts in Israel or outside the United States at those financial institutions. So the information is flowing to the IRS. When the other shoe drops, so to speak, for that particular person, or whether or not they're an attractive person for examination, is the big question mark. Who are they enforcing this against? However, it does put that particular person at significant risk, because although we discussed FBAR penalties in and of itself can be significant, there are additional informational reporting forms depending on the value in that account. Those penalties can be severe and stacked upon the FBAR penalties as well. So aside from, the penalties on the non-willful side that we discussed, there's also potential for criminal prosecution for people who are willfully hiding their assets abroad. And I think that's something that should be taken seriously.
Wow. First of all, I really appreciate the fact, Eli, that you have a very calm voice as you talk about something that really I think a lot of people should be getting very nervous about. Tell me something. Does it go both ways? America has been the 800-pound gorilla in the room as far as governments all over the world and banks over the world demanding that they provide information about American citizens who live outside the United States. But does America give back? Are they providing information as well to, for example, the Israeli government?
So that's been an area that's been a little bit lagging. So since the fall of the Swiss banks, the U.S. has ratcheted up the pressure on foreign jurisdictions to provide information. But I think there's a certain reciprocation that we're beginning to see with respect to information flowing back from the United States to other jurisdictions abroad to help them combat tax evasion, just like they've helped the United States.
Okay, we've spoken about, let's say, I'm sure there's a lot more scary stuff to discuss, but we've certainly spoken about the problems that people have. In the last few minutes, let's just touch on the solutions. Let's say that someone's listening and he says, I made a mistake and I didn't really think I needed to do this, but now I realize this is pretty important. What am I supposed to do? So what is he supposed to do?
So the IRS has essentially put into place amnesty programs, voluntary disclosures, processes in which a U.S. person can correct their noncompliance. There's a few different programs, and without getting too technical, there's one for willful people, which actually was just announced that it's going to be coming to an end on September 28th of 2018. So, whoever has willful exposure in hiding their foreign assets should consider using this program. It's called the Offshore Voluntary Disclosure Program. It essentially requires 8 years amended tax returns and 8 years informational reporting forms, and in exchange for waiving the statutory penalties, all those stacking penalties we discussed, the government charges 27.5% penalty of the highest balance in the account in the last 8 years. So, for example, if there was $1 million at one point, it's a $275,000 amnesty penalty, so to speak. That is the Offshore Voluntary Disclosure Program, ends with a closing agreement with a contract. And that's essentially for willful taxpayers. Now, the penalty
And then
goes
you're
up
not
to,
a criminal, right? Just to be clear, that means you're not going to be subject to going to jail.
Correct. It pretty much is. It's not a guarantee of non-prosecution, but the government doesn't forward these types of disclosures for prosecution because it would take the wind out of the sails for people coming in. It would be a disincentive. There is a 50% penalty in that program I'll mention if your bank is listed on the dirty bank list, so to speak, where if your bank is already on that list, you have to pay a 50% penalty. There's about 150 names on that list that you might want to reference to check. That's the willful people use that program. Non-willful people, there's essentially what's called a streamlined disclosure. There's two of them. One if you're living in the United States, one if you're living outside. The basic tenets are you amend your tax returns, you file your FBARs, 3 years returns, 6 years FBARs, and you pay, for people living in the United States, a 5% penalty on your offshore assets in the past 6 years, the highest year-end balance. And for taxpayers living outside the United States, they actually get a pass. So they pay zero penalty if they have reasonable cause and can certify that they're non-willful. So they get a better deal. So a lot of your listeners that are outside the United States, that are in Israel, may want to utilize the streamlined offshore procedures and potentially make a disclosure, get into compliance, and have penalty waivers so that they don't have to worry about their non-compliance going forward.
Wow, that certainly sounds like a much better option. Makes me breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief for people who may be able to benefit from this. Eli, this has been very helpful. I'm sure a lot of people benefited from what you told us today. In the last few seconds, just tell me, how can people follow you and follow your work?
I can be found on frosttaxlaw.com. Yes, frost like in the winter, FROSTTAX law.com. And they can feel free to reach out anytime. My phone number is 410-497-5947. Be glad to have a free consultation and discussion with respect to their specific facts and how we can help out.
Okay. Eli Noff, thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.